monitoring and managing site and client status. So every one of these series that I do always has like the miscellaneous nugget. And the topics are no less important than one of the other nuggets, but they're just little individual ones that don't seem to fit in any of the other nuggets. And so I tend to create this miscellaneous one, and this is the one. All of these are important. You can't really skip over any of these, but like I said, I just wanted to consolidate them all so that I could give you a list of the things you should be aware of. When you're going about the process of monitoring and managing your site and client status, there's going to be a number of different tasks that you have to do. I mean, like any good server, Config Manager requires regular care and feeding. You have to make sure that it's behaving correctly. You have to make sure that it takes its vitamins every day. Because if you don't, well, you're going to end up with some relatively big problems. So what are those activities? We want to talk about alerts. There are ways in which you can actually set up alerts when certain conditions occur, and you may want to do these. There are some alerts related to forefront endpoint protection that I actually didn't include in that nugget because I wanted to include them here. Also, managing the power states of your clients becomes important. At the end of the day, at 5 p.m., everybody goes away. How do you want to alter the settings associated with power so that you can get those machines down into a power state very, very fast? And you can do that with group policy. You can do that right on the machine, or you can do that with Configuration Manager. And Config Manager just gives you some very pretty graphs to show you exactly how many dollars you've saved. Remote control, no less important. Right? Many of us actually purchase Config Manager because we want to have the integrated remote control that comes with it. There are also some site, component, and client statuses that you will need to know, particularly when you end up having problems. And I'm going to show you where these are, and I'm going to show you how you can pull out the status information. The real detail is going to be based on what the specific problem of the day is going to be. So I'll show you how to get there, and then the actual troubleshooting when you experience your problems will be based off of the situation you're experiencing and what you're seeing in those status summarizers. Also, a couple of site maintenance tasks. Really what we're doing here is two things. One is turning on your Config Manager backups, and two is determining how much data you want Config Manager to keep whenever it goes through its database culling activity. So it scavenges the old data out of the database. So that's really what we're doing here with site maintenance tasks. Most of these are already turned on with the notable exception of backups here. And then I'm going to spend just a minute with Wake on LAN. A lot of environments don't actually leverage Wake on LAN. I'll show you how you can turn it on, and I'll spend just a second talking about the out-of-band service point. Not everybody has Intel vPro and can make use of the Intel active management technology that comes with Intel vPro. So Wake on LAN, even today, is still one of those technologies that you either subscribe to or you don't. So I'll give you some of the basics of that as well. So let's spend a minute talking about all these various sort of miscellaneous topics so that you're aware of where they are in your Config Manager infrastructure. The first one I want to talk about is alerts. And under here for the various device collections you have, if I take a look at one of the collections, we'll take a look at this Windows 7 x64 desktops. There's a tab up here that we actually skipped. And this tab actually allows us to set up one or more alerts that are associated with the collection. So here are the alert thresholds here, and I can view this collection in the dashboard if I want. The alerts here relate to when the clients are not actually verifying correctly, they're not actually coming in correctly, or when their remediation success falls below a threshold, or when their activity falls below a certain threshold percentage. So when you have clients that are not actually talking to your server and you reach a certain threshold percentage, and that is configurable, well, then you want to be alerted so you know that there's something going wrong with the clients in that collection. Now, as it relates to endpoint protection, these 4 items here can also identify, well, if I have a certain amount of malware, then I want to be notified. I want that information to be pushed to me. So let's say, for example, when I have client activity falling below a certain threshold, or when malware is detected. For either of these, you see that we have different specifics that I can determine, whether it's a critical or a warning, whether it's all detections, or if it's detected and pending in action. Over here for client activity, what specific settings do I want to set for client activity? So this will populate those alerts that you can then send off via email or send off via whatever mechanism you want, or even here in the console, to let you know whenever you're experiencing some major problems here within your environment. Now, in addition to alerts, also is the other tab here marked Power Management. Back in the day, way back in the day, Windows was either on or off. And in XP, and then again in Vista, and then again in Windows 7, Microsoft started adding in some very intelligent software, a very intelligent code into Windows that would essentially allow Windows to exist in a number of different power states. Power state, I think there was like 5 or 6 different power states. And the different power states would identify whether the machine was on versus off versus in a reduced power state mode, the monitor being off, for example, or the disk having spin down. So in any of these power states, what they're there for is to allow us to reduce the amount of power that's being used when users are not actively making use of the machine. Now, what's interesting, and I think a lot of people actually get confused about the implementation of power state, we're not necessarily saying that we want to power down the computer, but simply move it to a lower power state. And a lot of times what happens is we want to identify when our peak hours are going to be. A lot of us for us that would be 8 to 5, or maybe if we wanted to be careful from 7 to 6, for example. And those peak hours, we have a certain requirement for users so that we don't end up interrupting their actual workday. So here during the peak plan, I might want to set those machines to high performance. And in the specifics, I might want to turn off, for example, the hard disk after 4 hours, and turn off or move to hibernate after 4.5 hours, and turn off the monitor after 60 minutes. Now that state needs to be differentiated from the low power state, or the non-peak plan, where I essentially want to take these machines and put them in a power saver mode and adjust down these settings so that I'm much more quickly moving the machines to lower power state. For example, let's take a look here at the different options that exist. So I have a turn off the display value. I have a sleep value. I also have a, where did the hard disk, turn off hard disk value here. Now during the peak hours, each one of these actions is going to reduce the power consumption of that machine. Turning off the display is probably the first thing I want to do. Then probably turning off the hard disk. And then the third item is actually setting that to sleep. Because each of these, when the user returns back to their computer, well, each of these, the more amount of time that the user spends away from the computer, the more willing they are to deal with the extra seconds of delay that are required for these deeper power states, like setting it into sleep mode. During the day, I might want to set these to a longer value. So turn off the display after 60 minutes. Turn off the hard disk after 120 minutes, and then sleep after 180 minutes, for example. But at night, I might actually want to accelerate these so I can get to a lower power state and end up consuming less power when people aren't there. So at night, after 6 p.m., maybe it'll turn off the display after 10 minutes, and then turn off the hard disk after 15, and then sleep after 30. Again, getting these machines down into that lower power state much faster. So you can set these up with these configurations here by defining what your peak plan is and what your non-peak plan is. Also, if I want, I can actually set up a wake-up time for machines. So that wake-up time ensures that the machines are not actually in a bad power state when users actually end up coming in at the beginning of the day. Very useful stuff here. All of this is completely doable within group policy. in group policy preferences, specifically in group policy preferences. But by doing it here inside of Configuration Manager, what you get are better reports that will tell you exactly how much power you're saving. The next item we want to talk about here is remote control. Now, as I said, many of us actually have purchased our Config Manager infrastructure because, well, the remote tools that are available with that infrastructure allow us a lot of very good granular control over looking over the shoulder of users whenever they call in. Now, in the old 2007 days, one of the big reasons why we had to create multiple sites was for the purposes of having different remote control settings. The servers, for example, you might want for the servers that the servers do not prompt the user for remote control permission. But the desktops, you do prompt remote control for permission so that your users don't feel like you're playing Big Brother and looking over their shoulder. Here in Config Manager 2012, we can create multiple different policies in the same site. So I have the ability to choose different selections for different groups of users or different groups of machines, servers versus desktops, executives versus everybody else. These remote tools here give you all the different options for who has permitted access, whether it's enabled, what sorts of items are enabled between remote control, remote assistance, and remote desktop, and then also via which connections, the domain, private, and public connections if users are not connected up to the domain. So those are the remote tools settings. The next thing we want to talk about here are some of the site, component, and client status information that you can get and will actually need to take a look at whenever you're experiencing issues with your infrastructure. The first one are up here called system status, and you'll notice that there are 4 nodes here. The third one we really don't spend much time with because these days we don't end up with a lot of conflicting records unless we're doing some bad things with imaging systems and not removing or not installing the client appropriately on imaged systems. Now, site status and component status, however, give us this very nice heads-up display for helping us understand if we're actually, if the environment, if the Config Manager infrastructure is healthy or not. See, we've got these nice green icons here for the software update point, for the different roles that exist here, for the site server. Again, for component status, I can take a look at the individual components that are part of this site server. Now you'll notice that some of these actually show a warning. These actually end up showing warnings because we've exceeded the threshold for the number of error messages or critical messages that we've experienced over a period of time. And you can tune these, but really the idea here is to give you a notion of when you might want to actually take a look at some of the components to see if they're actually experiencing a problem. Let's take a look at Active Directory User Discovery and show all the messages that have occurred in the last day. This gives us a look at all the different things that have been going on for that component. Well, let's see here. The SMS executive is scheduled to start. Active Directory has found one valid container in the site control file. It happened again here. It looks like actually this is relatively okay. So in this case, maybe this component is in fact in an acceptable behavior. Right? Maybe I'm not really concerned about the error messages that have occurred, but because maybe some of these error messages have occurred over an extended period of time and I'm not really interested in viewing them. So when that happens, I can actually reset the counts to return this back to essentially zeros and return this component back to a good health. Same thing up here with site status. If I recognize that there's some sort of issue going on with one of the roles on this machine, I can again show the messages here to see over a period of time what sorts of log values have that component actually been reporting into the database. You will spend essentially no time here until you actually need to spend time here. And the level of logging, even at the default level, is remarkable. Config Manager has always been exceptional at reporting every little thing that it does so that you know what's going on under the covers. And in fact, it has to. You think about all the different activities that it's doing in the background, it needs to have these site statuses so that you can actually get a good feel for what's going on. Now, if you want to actually dig in a little deeper, These status message queries here will give you specifics about the types of status messages you're looking for. So these are just simple queries. It's no different than doing a query before where you're doing it against inventory data. But here what we're doing is actually looking for status message data that we're limiting via one or more constraints. And there's a whole bunch of these queries here. So when you are experiencing a problem and you are having trouble finding any information here via the green items or the yellow items, well, choosing down here under status message queries will help you to tailor down to find exactly the types of status messages that you're looking for. Now, back in the day, dealing with clients was a bit of a challenge because the hardest part, I think I'd said earlier, in managing a config manager infrastructure is ensuring that you have clients on all the equipment in your environment, and also ensuring that those clients are actually participating in your config manager infrastructure. You can have, for example, a situation where a client is not talking to its config manager server, and because that client is not talking appropriately, well, you're going to end up with bad statistics in your compliance metrics. It'll take longer for your applications to send out. Your updates won't get deployed within an appropriate amount of time. So these new client status values here help you understand when you've actually seen client activities and when the clients have completed in a client check. So we see here that under client check, 4 of our available systems that have been discovered in this config manager server have actually passed the client check. But over under client activity, I see that 1 is actually inactive. If I click on this client that's inactive, I can then view exactly who that client is, and that'll give me some more information about why is that client not talking, and what might I need to do to remediate the problems with that client. Having this here built into Config Manager compared to the old version is far superior and gives you the ability to really dig down into finding out why those clients are not behaving appropriately. Now, in addition to dealing with all these clients, there are also a number of site maintenance tasks as well that need to occur. These site maintenance tasks are essentially the different types of care and feeding activities that need to occur on a regular basis just to keep your config manager's site healthy. If I take a look here at sites and right-click on one of the sites that I have, you'll notice this site maintenance item. And there are a long list here of site maintenance tasks that are installed and running by default. As you'll notice, most of these tasks deal with just simply eliminating the data that is no longer relevant for your world. Now, here's where you can make some very important decisions about how much data you actually want to keep. So, for example, delete aged inventory data. By default, Config Manager is actually going to keep 90 days of inventory data. And if that for you is too much data, if you want to narrow the window of data from 90 days to perhaps 30 days or 14 days, this will ensure that you don't have any aged, no longer relevant inventory data that exists in your environment. A lot of people actually end up reducing a number of these items here so that the window, the sliding window of data that your config manager server has relates to only the freshest data in your environment. And you don't end up, like you have with your Active Directory, having a bunch of computer accounts that are sitting out there that are no longer really relevant anymore. Again, the importance of this is ensuring that you actually have all the data so that your compliance reports, whether they be for updates or for applications, can show the correct data and don't end up not hitting 100% because you don't have, or you're referencing them against clients that are not talking to your config manager infrastructure. Of these tasks, the vast majority of them are something that you can ignore, at least in the short run. You may want to adjust some of the range of data that you have, but for the most part, many of these are ignorable, at least for now. One, however, that you absolutely will want to address is this task up top called Backup Site Server, because this is, of all the tasks, the one that's not turned on by default. Now, in a world today where applications seem to be getting harder and harder to back up, the process to back up a config manager server is one of the, well, it's fairly rudimentary, but it's actually also fairly brilliant in the way that it's actually been constructed. When you turn on the backup site server task and give it a destination, I can give that a local drive destination here, c:\sms backup. Let's see if it actually asks for a folder. There, it doesn't. and then identify which days of the week you want it backed up, what this does is it actually invokes a backup on the server. Now what does that do? We're not really interested in this backup in the actual content. That's what your source files location is for. And because your backup solution will typically gather all the files and folders in that source files location without any problems, again, I'm not terribly interested in it. But all the metadata associated with that with this site, the metadata is really difficult to gather in an easily restorable way. So what this backup site task does is pause the database so that a snapshot can be created, so that a file can be created and dumped onto disk into that whatever location we put in there, SMS backup, so that the next time your backup solution swings around at the end of the day to gather its backup, that backup will be in a file-based format, which really makes the restore process very easy. I don't have to worry about SQL agents and quiescing databases and all this extra effort because, well, the process just happens for me. And as long as I gather the contents of this backup location, and as long as I gather my source files location, well, I end up really gathering all the things that I need in that backup. Now, what a lot of people don't recognize, however, is that the backup itself is actually configurable. You can actually make changes to what you want the backup activity to actually back up. And if we take a look here at C and then Program Files, Configuration Manager, and if I look at inboxes and then SMS bkup.box, which is here, in this location is going to be a human-readable backup control file called SMS bkup.ctl. Let me go ahead and open that up here with Windows, with Notepad here. Open up here, take a look at it in Notepad, and you'll notice that it is a very human-readable file, and that there are areas within the blocks where you can actually edit to add your own custom configurations. So here are some default destination tokens that are used as variables here in the backup file. You can add any custom tokens here. You can add custom commands before the file executes or before the backup executes. Also, some additional backup tasks that you want to, or files that you want to back up in this case. Any registry keys you also want to back up. So all of these provide a location for you to customize this backup so that when you have to restore your config manager server, well, you can do so relatively easily. What's also not really well understood is how the backup actually works. And if I take a look here at the services console on the config manager server, you'll notice that config manager actually has a number of different services that it makes use of. Down here, SMS Executive is the executive service for all the different threads that are and components that are actually running on this config manager server. But you'll notice we have this SMS site backup service that exists down here, and it's a task that's set as a manual task. If you go about starting this task, the task will start, and then a few minutes later the task will stop. That's because this task or this service is actually the action of completing an SMS site backup. So if you ever want to kick off a backup out of your normal time span, you can do so by simply starting the service and then allowing it to complete. Once the service is no longer running, well, you know that the backup has completed. The last task I want to, or maintenance item that I want to talk about here is Wake on LAN. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time here on Wake on LAN just simply because most people either subscribe to it fully or do not. And in previous versions, Wake on LAN was something that didn't function very well. These days, with the integration of Intel vPro and Intel's active management technology, if you're running Intel servers, well, the process of doing Wake on LAN is a little bit better than it used to be. I'm going to show you two items and gloss over them very, very generally, just so that you're aware where they're at if you want to make use of this out-of-band management. The first is here under Servers. If I right-click and choose to add a site system role, there is an out-of-band service point here that you can actually add to your server for when you make use of Intel vPro and Intel's AMT, Active Management Technology. Now, enabling this out-of-band service point, there's obviously the first item here is a couple of settings that you want, but to do so you actually have to have an AMT provisioning certificate that requires a PKI. So in order to make use of AMT, there are a couple of prerequisites that are required simply to secure the connections between your config manager server and the clients you're waking up via Wake on LAN. The last item we want to see here is the Wake on LAN setting that you'll find here under the properties of the site itself, and that's here. I can turn on Wake on LAN for this site. You'll notice I get an error message here about the out-of-band service point role, and then I can choose how I want to actually facilitate waking up computers, either using AMT or using classic wake-up packets. Really, these two items are the beginning of what you need to know as it relates to Wake on LAN. There's a little bit of extra stuff that's required here, but it's kind of out of scope for this nugget. But these are the processes you can use for enabling Wake on LAN. Now, what does that get you? If you recall, back when we were actually creating advertisements, any sort of deployment that we create, we have the ability to also enable Wake on LAN for that deployment. So if we have machines that are turned off and I need to deploy out an application at a certain period of time, late at night or what have you, I can enable Wake on LAN in the advertisement so that it will make use of the Wake on LAN functionality that's been configured here. That's really what you get out of enabling that, and there are other network level customizations that need to occur as well. If you plan on enabling Wake on LAN, spend some time actually researching this, but these are the points that you need to be aware of here in Config Manager. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the monitoring and managing tasks associated with the site and also associated with our clients. Just like any good server, Config Manager requires regular care and feeding. We've got to actually go about all those different activities that make our Config Manager server a happy and healthy one. So in this nugget we talked about alerts, how to configure power management and remote control. We went through some of the site component and client status functions so that you can help troubleshoot whenever problems occur. We turned on the backup site maintenance task and talked about some of the places where we might adjust some of those site maintenance tasks, and then spent a minute just talking about configuring Wake on LAN. Coming up next, we're going to almost wrap up things with a short talk about security, and specifically Config Manager 2012's new role-based security model. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.